evening, everyone. To all the attendees, to Fairing, to all our sponsors, all the speakers, and Fertility Show Africa, FASA, SASREC, and all of you are here watching today. I've been in the field of fertility for many years, like many of us. My journey started with trying to have kids, which didn't happen until years down the line. And I am fascinated by the advances in fertility, which leads me to my talk on losing my DNA, where I'll be talking about egg donor and gamete donation. Now, if we have a look at who considers donor conception, we have our heterosexual couples who maybe have a low AMH or no sperm and maybe need sperm donors. We're looking at our single parents who have no partners and maybe need egg or sperm donation, or both, probably. And then the LGBTQ plus community. So this is where we're dealing with surrogacy, or we're dealing with single fathers who need an egg donor. So over the years, and I do a lot of collaboration with Europe and the Donor Conception Network, PARAMOUNT and all the acts governing DNA and egg disclosure and anonymity is all guided by the Children's Act. So PARAMOUNT is the long-term well-being of the child. And this is something that parents often grapple with. Just to go back to the process of infertility, there is a lot of grief and loss in infertility. There's this huge loss of control that we go through, and this is even prior to maybe having to consider using an egg or sperm donor or a donor gamete. There is the loss of hopes and dreams we're dealing with, and the loss possibly in single parents of a partner. And this changes by the hour. It's a transition, it's even an hour-to-hour thing, a day-to-day thing. And I often see with my recipients that they maybe come to terms with what we're dealing with, and the next day there's kind of a bit of hesitation. And I assert to all of you, it is so important when we're going this route to look for support and look for the next route to go. Now, when we're looking at potentially losing or not using our own DNA, there is a process of closure. And when I first see someone, a recipient who is possibly looking at the option of using egg donation or sperm donation, I promise you they all sit in my consulting room and cannot even say the word donor. So for those of you who are uncomfortable with my talk and uncomfortable with the word, I'm telling you it is absolutely appropriate not being able to even say that word. By the second session, we're starting to look at options ahead. And people often come to me and say, well, I don't want to explore the options until I have dealt with this loss and this grief. And counseling is so important. And I want to bring up the slide where it says loss and acceptance of the next decision is a simultaneous process. And the decision ultimately lies with the end goal. So we have a look at what is your worst case scenario, what is the next step, and can we get acceptance at the same time? We need both recipients to be on the same page. I don't know how often I have sat in a consulting room with a husband who is maybe very eager to say, listen, I'm happy to go the sperm donor route, or I'm happy to go the egg donor route, not realizing that that's pretty hurtful to the wife who's not yet on the same page. So it's also important, if you're considering this route, I think that as a couple, we both need to go through the same process and get to the same point of acceptance. Now, that last point on my previous slide is peace of mind. We are so tired about people saying to us, relax and it'll happen. We're tired about these stories of just adopt and it'll happen. And my talk yesterday alluded to this, that even in ancient Greece, adoption used to be a cure for having a baby of your own. Now, peace of mind is more about not just relaxing, it's about having having an acceptance of the next step, which creates a peace of mind for the processes leading up to what you're going through. And that's what we ideally want. Now, if we're looking at donor conception, it is not for everyone. But in my 26 years of practice, I have only seen one couple in all my years who have not decided to go this route, because they have looked at the value attached to the end goal. And we've managed to counsel thousands of patients to actually accepting egg, sperm, and gamete donation. Now, I said to you earlier that closure and acceptance actually hold hands. And I use this example of two beakers. And I've got a picture here. I would love to have a jug with two glasses. And I say to patients often, that first beaker that you're holding in your hand is filled with loss and grief that you can't have your own baby. And oftentimes it's only after the fact, when we get to that crossroads, that patients come and they present and say, I've been told by my fertility specialist that this is the end of the road, and now I've got to deal with my grief, and then I will look at the next step. And I'm saying it's not. There's two beakers here. There's one beaker full of loss, and there's one beaker that has nothing in. And we start exploring what is the hope and the expectation and the future, possibly with donor gametes or with different DNA. And as we start exploring that, and I'll give you some tips on how to explore that, so the beaker of loss gets less and the hope and excitement grows. And it's a simultaneous kind of process that happens spontaneously. Now, what I often do is, whilst people are still engaged on probably or maybe using their own DNA if that's a possibility, I get them to expose themselves to donor egg agencies or donor sperm agencies or sperm banks and have a look at the different profiles. The first time you sit on that laptop is absolutely daunting, and your heart rate goes up and you shut it. It's like exposing you to your worst case scenario all in one go. But I can promise you, with recurrent exposure, it does become a little bit easier. And if we look at, we'll look at epigenetics just now, but if we look at where are you in terms of the profiles and how do you select a donor? I know it's taking this topic a little bit lightheartedly, but I almost say, let's have a look at the donor as a paper doll. So it's almost like, let's have a look at physical attributes that are kind of common to you, such as your height, maybe your weight, maybe, like me, if you've got these sticking out ears or a dimple. We kind of look for those physical attributes, and then we try and dress them up, because you'll see on my next slide that mostly the makeup of a child is 90% about the environment, and 90% about nurture, and 90% about what is happening in your womb. So over the years, we have proven that actually your DNA or your blood being transferred through specifically an egg donor or donor gamete is actually having an influence on the outcome of the child, the nutrients you take, etc. Obviously, with sperm donation, we need a longer term of acceptance, but we do know that exposure to certain environmental factors during the pregnancy and then immediately afterwards has an impact on the makeup of the child. The second thing I put there is you need to like the profiles. So you might go to an agency and you might say, I have 5 donors in front of me and they all seem like they could fit me physically. And then I say to you, well, have a look, and how do I choose? And I say, maybe you've got to have a look at who do you like. Because if you think about it, who are we drawn to? We're drawn to people who are very similar in nature to us. People who maybe have the same likes and dislikes. And again, this is not something that personality-wise your child's going to inherit from the donor, but it's going to facilitate your attachment to the child, because we're drawn to someone we like. If you're an animal lover, you're drawn to a profile of someone you like. And I can promise you, if you've got 5 profiles sitting in front of you, you're going to be drawn to the one that has similar interests, similar activities, similar books that they read, and you're going to say, that's just like me. Now, there's always this big question. Who is the parents of the donor gametes? Egg, sperm, embryos. Is it the genetic makeup, or is it the person who carries the child? By law, it is your child. So by law, it is yours. If we look at the more philosophical question about who is the makeup of the baby, it is those that raise the baby. I've discussed nature versus nurture. Epigenetics, which I'll give you a little bit more detail on now. And I often say to people, look at children who you think resemble their parents. It's not so much their dimple or their nose. If I look at my kids, it is the way they pace when they're on the phone, it is the way they laugh, it is their facial expressions, and that is learned. That is definitely learned. Epigenetics, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but it's basically the premise that your genes can be expressed in different ways dependent on the environment. So you're carrying DNA from a donor, but the uterine care you take care of and the nutrients you take and the way you take care of your pregnancy actually switches on and imprints different DNA expressions that are similar to your own. So not only do we have the role of the environment, education, etc., we also have the role of actual DNA, and there's proof of this if we look at genotypes versus phenotypes. The instructions of the expression of that baby are primarily by the birth mother. Now, it's an interesting one. I've been working with egg donors for about 20 years, and people often say, who donates eggs or who donates sperm? Are people doing this for the money? What are they doing it for? Now, I must say, we are very fortunate in South Africa that we have amazing laws and incredible agencies. And a recent study by Associate Professor Don Richtolder in 2020 had a look at, and he specifically looked at egg donors. What kind of people are donating their eggs? Is it for financial compensation? Is it for altruistic reasons? And it was quite a large study he did, and the primary factor that came up was altruism. The egg donors I see are often organ donors, they're often blood donors, platelet donors, and they know someone who's maybe gone through infertility, which is why they donate. It's not for the money. We don't see that anymore. The average time donors donate is 2.48. So even though law governs that we're only allowed a certain number of births in South Africa, generally you're not going to find a donor who's donating 6 times or 8 times and having 8 live births. That's not going to happen. It's nothing you need to be concerned about. Very big controversial topic. Disclosure or transparency to the child. In South Africa, we have laws governing that all our egg and sperm donors are anonymous and protected by law. So the child actually cannot go and meet the egg or the sperm donor when they're 18. And for years in South Africa specifically, most of my recipients have focused on what we call non-disclosure or lack of transparency. So secrecy, if you might. There's this big debate. Do I disclose this to my child? Or would there be no egg and sperm donors in the country if I did that? Now, if we look at disclosure, I always say it is not a decision you need to make up front when you're sitting with us. First, get comfortable with the process, and then we will make the decision on disclosure. The needs of the child are paramount, which is why there's this huge movement, you'll see on my next slide, in Europe, Australia, the US, to actually be, and they don't use the word disclosure, they use the word openness. 75% of the people I see nowadays are willing to actually disclose that they've used an egg or sperm donor. And especially with single moms who are using sperm donors, it is something that we would rather there not be any secrecy, because creating a narrative for the child and creating some sort of lie is not the ideal at all, because that contravenes what we're trying to do with the child. Now, the DSC network, which is Donor Conception Network, they talk about openness versus secrecy. And why is that? Because they say that openness is a state of mind over time. So if we say, I'm going to disclose to my child that they're an egg donor, disclosure kind of implies a once-off disclosure, whereas openness is over time, and it's a narrative that we're comfortable with. Now, like I said, in South Africa, we are governed and our donors are protected, but around the world, especially driven by donor-conceived adults, and with donor registries becoming more common. So right now in South Africa, we have everything is kept anonymous with different codes and different names so that our database is secure. But around the world, in Europe and all over, times have changed, and they're starting to head towards openness. or as we say, disclosure. The other problem, which was featured in Carte Blanche last year, is this direct-to-consumer DNA testing. It is so easy to go overseas and do a DNA swab of your saliva and find out what your DNA is. Now, in South Africa, maybe we're not seeing a lot of people do this, but as the trend starts moving, and we often a little bit behind Europe and the US and Australia, we're going to see this happening more and more often. We also think the willingness to be open about the egg donation or the sperm donation might be an indication as to the readiness to pursue the next step. So it is an important indicator, as opposed to living with this, not even a white lie, but this big secret that you've got and being uncomfortable with it. Maybe it's something we've got to address before you go into this and decide what you're going to do. So in conclusion, I'd like to say we need to acknowledge that this is a grief process. And grief has not got any equation. I wish there was a simple algebra or simple linear kind of graph that we could apply to everyone, but it's not. So you've got to keep in mind that it is these two beakers. And you're going to, just because you're grieving about your loss of your DNA, it doesn't mean you're not ready to take the next step. We need to go through the grief in order to have that excitement come out. Don't be open until you're comfortable. So I often say, I have a list of books that I show people, we go through discussions, we look at worst case scenarios, and I'm saying when you're comfortable that you're going to be open with us about your child, then you can be open about it to others. But you might actually say, hang on a second, I'm protecting my child. So I don't need to tell extended family, all my friends, all my colleagues, because it's the right of my child to reveal that. Openness and transparency, again, may be an indicator of acceptance of the next stage, but we, again, both need to be on the same page. And then, finally, I'm saying seek support. Because of this veil of secrecy over the last 20, 30 years in South Africa, egg donations and sperm donations and recipients don't come forward and seek support in terms of groups, in terms of speaking to friends, because of the stigma attached to using egg donors, sperm donors, donor gametes. And I'm saying seek support if you cannot with friends or family, seek support with online platforms, with different support groups if you can. And again, your mood changes day to day, hour to hour. But the level that you remain hooked about your decision and the intensity of that grief becomes less with time. And just because it's changing from one day to the next, I can promise you one thing, and I love this slide at the end. If you worry about attachment, over my 20 years of working with egg donors and sperm donors, I have never once in my life had someone, and it gives me shivers, not once in my life when they're holding this baby, have they ever regretted the decision they've gone through. Their attachment has been absolutely phenomenal. No difference between whether it was their own DNA or not. And the amazing thing is that attachment starts happening when those embryos are in the laboratory already. You're rooting for those embryos as though they're your own, and they are your own. So worrying about attachment is something that I can promise you is not anything that you need to worry about. And thank you for your time. And yes, I'm just saying this is an amazing, science gives us this opportunity. So if your end goal is to be a parent, it is something that is worth exploring. And you can close that book if it's not for you. Thank you.